Welcome to Module 4, Neurodiversity, Affirming Supports and Accommodations for Dyslexic Students. I think it's important to talk about creating neurodiversity affirming classrooms by also addressing the fact that it's so important to reduce the stigma that is associated with neurodivergent diagnoses, whether it is ADHD or autism or dyslexia or another type of neurodiversity. There is a fear associated with these labels, and ultimately, that fear is what prevents people from getting the help that they need. We want to help kids understand themselves and understand their diagnoses. And if they're dyslexic, let's just call it that. There's no reason to be afraid of that, and we don't want them to be afraid of it either. As a matter of fact, helping them understand how their brain works is going to be a benefit for them because they'll better be able to self-advocate and understand why some things might be harder for them than other kids. It's not that they're dumb or that they aren't trying very hard. It's just that this is the way your brain is wired, and we need to teach you in a way that supports you and helps you based on the way you're wired. There are a lot of people who are well known who have spoken openly about their experience with dyslexia. Anderson Cooper, Robin Williams, Keira Knightley, Whoopi Goldberg, Octavia Spencer, Jennifer Aniston, just to name a few. There are also lots of great picture books that we can use and chapter books as well to help kids understand neurodiversity and understand themselves. Some that might be worth checking out. Did You Say Paschetti? Aaron Slater Illustrator, and The Map Challenge. For some of those older students, you might want to check out The Brilliant World of Tom Gates, Diary of a Dyslexic School Kid, and Fish in a Tree. These books don't have to be made accessible only for the dyslexic students in your class either. We can even let all of the kids in the class read the book and just come to a better understanding of neurodiversity for everybody. Let's talk briefly about a couple of other diagnoses that fall under that umbrella of neurodiversity and are also really common with our dyslexic students. The first one is dysgraphia, which is a discrepancy between oral and written language skills. Quite often, this goes hand in hand with dyslexia, especially related to the difficulties with spelling and other written work. You might see students who struggle with dysgraphia who have poor spelling skills, or they avoid writing, especially unknown words. They might have very weak writing fluency, and it takes them a long time to get anything written. And they might also show illegible handwriting. Some kids have difficulty just getting their thoughts into words and putting them on paper. The other diagnosis that fits along with those specific learning disabilities is dyscalculia. Dyscalculia is a mismatch between the conceptual understanding of math and the application of basic skills. So very similar to dyslexia, where somebody might have great understanding and reading comprehension, but struggle with the basics. You probably see this with students who struggle with mental math and rote math memorization, and they might have confusion about, for example, telling time or sequencing of events. Let's talk about the strengths of dyslexic learners because that can help us drive our strengths-based instruction. A lot of our dyslexic learners are holistic or global thinkers. It can be really beneficial for these holistic and global thinkers for us to start with the big picture overview before getting into the details. So for example, we might use a timeline of events in history rather than simply working through the events chronologically. When we introduce the concept with that timeline and they can get that big picture view, it helps them then put those other things into context. Making connections between concrete and abstract concepts can also be helpful for these kids. So for example, if you're teaching students about cause and effect in reading, you might ask them to brainstorm specific examples of cause and effect that they've seen in their own life. This would be an example of going from an abstract to a concrete concept. An example of the reverse of this, going from concrete to abstract, would be teaching about specific animal adaptations in a biology class, and then asking those students to identify other types of adaptation that take place outside of the animal world. A second strength that a lot of dyslexic students might show is visual spatial thinking. Rather than using language-based tools only to convey information to our students, when we can integrate visual imagery for our visual spatial thinkers, that can help them to exchange information and retain information that they've been taught. You might try to use visual note-taking, for example, where they're actually using doodles to demonstrate what they're hearing in the lecture rather than just trying to write it down. Providing lots of instruction on how to use graphic organizers and access to them for all different activities is another tool that can really help these learners. And finally, using infographics is another way to help visual spatial learners connect with the information. If you are looking for a ton of ideas about how to integrate visual spatial thinking into your classroom, I would highly recommend the book Visual Learning and Teaching by Dr. Susan Daniels. There's a link to it in the supplemental materials for the course. In Dr. Daniels' book, she gives a lot of really practical examples that you could put to use in your classroom right away. For example, she gives a list of various types of analytic diagrams that could be used, some of which we might not have even thought about. You can pause if you want to take a look at this list more closely. Another common strength for dyslexic learners has to do with being creative and divergent thinkers. There's mixed research about the connection between dyslexia and creativity, although there is solid research on ADHD and creativity, which many dyslexic students also have. The more we can provide opportunities for creative thinking through open-ended prompts with lots of right answers, we're going to get a lot more out of these students. We can validate and encourage the creative concepts that they formulate and find flexible options for them to show their learning. So how do we take what we know about dyslexic learners, the struggles they face and the strengths that they have, and create accommodations that help them achieve in the classroom? So accommodations for students can be put forth either through an individualized education plan or a Section 504 plan. Additionally, many of us as educators tend to put these accommodations into place in our classroom just because we know students need them. Accommodations become even more necessary for dyslexic learners as they get older, especially when they are reading to learn instead of learning to read. We want to make sure that they have the supports that they need to be successful. An IEP process, one of the steps in creating that IEP is to inquire about what accommodations can be beneficial for a student. Some of our students may not qualify for special education services, but perhaps they might qualify for a Section 504 plan. When we talk about what types of accommodations are available for a student through a Section 504 plan, we need to consider what major life activities substantially impact them. What we're really looking for by providing accommodations is to make sure that students are able to access the curriculum and the instruction that is appropriate for their ability. We might see that for a dyslexic student, the major life activities that are impacted include performing manual tasks, reading, thinking, learning, concentrating, and so on. There's no definitive list of what major life activities can or can't be included in a Section 504 plan. Whether a student qualifies for a Section 504 plan or not, if they are dyslexic, they probably need some accommodations. And we want to make sure that kids have the opportunities that they deserve. One important factor, especially as we get to the older grades, is to make sure that just because a student is dyslexic does not mean that they are prevented from accessing courses like honors or AP courses. It's hard because I know a lot of the teachers in those programs are not used to providing a lot of accommodations. But what we have to realize is that providing an accommodation is a way for them to have the same opportunities as their peers. It doesn't mean watering down the content. It simply means providing it in a way that makes it available to them. A student might very well have the cognitive ability to handle the content and the critical thinking associated with some of those upper level courses, but they might need some supports in how they access the specific reading material that's provided. So whether a student has a Section 504 plan, an IEP, or none of the above, let's think about the ways that we can provide some accommodations to support them. So there are 5 main types of accommodations that I feel we need to consider when we're talking about how to support a student. So the first type of accommodation is a behavioral accommodation. So a behavioral accommodation asks this question: what supports does this child require to manage their emotions and behaviors for effective learning to take place? So if a dyslexic student needs support in the form of a behavioral accommodation, it's most likely because they have some co-occurring anxiety or ADHD or something along those lines. We can work with them to create a collaborative system so that the student can monitor their behavioral goals and provide accommodations to reduce distraction or improve focus. We also want to make sure that any of these supports are available throughout the school day and not just in one particular classroom. The second type of accommodation is an environmental accommodation. Looking at environmental accommodations, we ask, what can we change about the student's learning environment to help them succeed? So if we change the surroundings to help them learn and improve their functioning, that might include preferential seating or alternate locations for doing their work or taking tests, or other types of sensory tools that help them in the environment. The third type of accommodation is evaluative, and this one's really important for our dyslexic students. Here we ask, how can we modify the ways in which the student shows us what they know during assessments? How are we asking them to show mastery of the content? One major factor for dyslexic students is having extended time. Research shows that on tests of reading, dyslexic students were able to perform as well as their non-dyslexic peers when they were given the extra time to read and complete the assessments. They might also benefit from having a test read aloud to them or being offered a scribe to help with some of those writing difficulties. We can make sure that we're not grading or spelling or grammar on some of their assessments. And we can also make sure that we base any sort of reading goals on the number of minutes that they read as opposed to the number of books that are read. The next type of accommodation is instructional, which asks us what the best ways are to present material for the student to learn. Some common accommodations in this area include providing notes in advance or fill in the blanks. We might use dyslexia-friendly fonts. We can also give them opportunities to use graphic organizers and visual spatial thinking tools. Another instructional accommodation might be exemptions from a foreign language requirement in high school. We want to provide options to help them handle reading fatigue because it takes so much effort for them to read for long extended periods of time. We might want to provide some accommodations for handwriting. Sometimes dyslexic students might have difficulty with providing on-the-spot oral answers. We might want to find a way to give them advance notice of a question that's coming their way so they have time to prepare their response. The fifth type of accommodation is an organizational accommodation, which asks what type of organizational tools could be used to support the student. If students have a comorbid diagnosis of ADHD, they might require more of these supports for organization. For example, methods for staying on track with projects and assignments, and tools to remember materials for classes. But I don't know that there are organizational accommodations that are needed if a student only has the diagnosis of dyslexia. Assistive technology is another component that can fall under those accommodations. And depending on how we're using it, it might fall into various categories of accommodations. The definition of assistive technology is the services and devices that enable people with disabilities to accomplish daily living tasks, assist them in communication, work, or recreation activities, and ultimately help them achieve greater independence and enhance their quality of life. You might have some items that are very low tech, all the way up to very high tech to help them accomplish these tasks. One of the main considerations when we're looking at using assistive technology for students is that it must be usable based on the child's skills. It also requires us to be aware of what they are willing to use. And really, that goes along with any accommodations. A lot of times neurodivergent kids don't want to feel different. So that's another aspect of normalizing the diagnosis and asking for those supports. The more we can normalize the process of accessing accommodations, the better. Some examples of the major life activities that we might support with assistive technology include some for reading, such as audiobooks, text-to-speech software, and e-readers that customize text display. There's really not a lot of research that actually talks about how fonts specific to dyslexia help dyslexic learners. However, there definitely are fonts that can help them with reading fatigue and making it easier to follow along. It's important to remember that audiobooks are not cheating, and it doesn't take anything away from the reading experience unless the specific task that is being assessed is decoding the words. MRI research shows that individuals who are reading visually or listening to an audiobook have all of the same parts of their brain activated as they take in that information. Text-to-speech software is great because it can read any text, anything from PDFs to books, and most textbooks are available as digital files. When we're talking about kids who might struggle with writing, we want to maybe look at using word processors and spell checkers. Spell checkers definitely have limited capabilities. However, it can remove a barrier for some of those students who struggle with spelling. Speech-to-text software is great if they can get familiar and comfortable with using it because it removes the barrier of trying to spell those words. Word prediction software is another way that we can accommodate kids who struggle with writing. Another example of a major life activity that can be supported through assistive technology is fluency related to writing as opposed to written expression, where students might benefit from recording devices or smart pens. I'll give one example of some of the cool things that technology can do. So this is a Live Scribe smart pen, and it's one of my favorite devices that I've seen kids use. In addition to being able to record a lecture that's going on, you actually use this type of pen to write on a special type of paper. And so then when you go back through and are looking at your notes, if there was a part where you missed, you can put your pen on that little piece of paper, kind of like a GPS function of some kind, and goes right back to the part of the lecture that was being recorded when you made that mark on your page. There are lots of opportunities to use assistive technology to help our dyslexic students. So we're going to take a break and do some case studies, and then we'll come back and talk through those in just a moment.